Good evening. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your patience. And thank you. I can't see too many of you, but thank you in advance for I know what will be a fantastic session. Delighted, privileged, all of those good things to meet you in person, Anand. Heard so many lovely things about you. Not just because we share a publisher in common, but your trip to India has caused so much stir. There's a lot of buzz around it. You've clearly redefined change, possibility, the art of influencing. I've been reading some of the endorsements from your book, which talks about a beacon of hope, possibilities, a new optimism. There's so much he has to share with us today. Before we get started and dig really deep into his book, Persuasion, I really want to know more about him, the man, and his India connection. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
I love that you start like that. Well, thank you all for braving the Prabha Devi traffic to be here. It's not easy. There are many probably, we imagine, just stranded downstairs somewhere. They didn't make it. So Darwinian competition to make it into the Quorum. My wife Priya had an event here a few hours ago that some of you may have been at. And for both of us, this is a very special return and homecoming, delayed by the pandemic, but I became a writer in this city. I got my first job in journalism for the New York Times when I was 23 years old, starting here in Mumbai, became a correspondent here, had that job for several years. I was actually the first person for the New York Times in Mumbai in the modern era. Everyone had always been in Delhi. And I made an argument for this city being essential for the New York Times to have someone on the ground in this city. And I won that, speaking of persuasion, I won that argument because Mumbai was a business story, and the business story was but I didn't really want to write about business, but I just used, we have to have someone in Mumbai, the stock market's there. But what was the defining thing of the 5 years I ended up being a correspondent here, was that because I was not in Delhi, I didn't have to write about ministers and shuffling of things and elections and Kashmir and war movements. I essentially, and I kind of ignored the stock market. I got to write about people. And these were the years 2005 to 2009. I looked at what was happening in China, I looked at what was happening in other developing countries, and the Chinese story is a story of like buildings and bridges and very fast trains and like things, and it's a very physical story of the transformation and makeover of a country. And often in India there was this insecurity about like, why does it not look like that here? Why are we not moving that quickly? And there was a lot of focus around, there was that kind of Mumbai 2020, which is now long past, like make Mumbai look like Shanghai, all of this. And as I worked as a correspondent here, and I should say, I grew up in the United States. I was born in the United States. My parents both grew up in Mumbai, met in Mumbai, fell in love in Mumbai. So I grew up with an idea and stories of it, but I had not lived here until I moved here in my 20s and became a correspondent. I realized that the story that I was telling here was not a story about bridges and buildings and, although that stuff is happening, it was a story about what's happening inside people's hearts and minds in this country. What I felt was a revolutionary change in mentalities and psychologies and people revolting against all kinds of definitions of who they were supposed to be. Women revolting against various definitions of who women are supposed to be in this society, people from lower castes and other trampled backgrounds revolting against definitions of what they were supposed to be, people from the countryside revolting against the idea that you have to do your dad and grandfather's job the way they did that job. I wrote so much about young women in small towns who, their father said you can't work, you can't leave the house. Mm-hmm. And then they found out how much ICICI was paying young women in the neighboring town. And the dad suddenly was like, I've always been for women working. I'm a big, big believer in that. And so I just feel very privileged to come back here all these years later. I left being a full-time reporter here in 2009, and I've been many times since. But it's so. This will always be the city where I learned to write about, be a writer in general, and tell this incredible story of this country. Not necessarily having the kind of explosive growth that some other places have, not necessarily solving every challenge, certainly not that it has, but something stirring here in those years that I was a correspondent that felt really dramatic, and so it's always very special. Feels like a homecoming.
So the journey from Mumbai, that clearly, or Bombay as I still call it, and probably you do too, a very special connection to being described as a left-wing American journalist, a potent symbol of America's political tribalism. How did that happen?
And the Financial Times calling you left-wing is sort of a badge of honor. She also said I dressed for our interview more like a fashion designer than a journalist, which told me more about her friends than my clothes.
I had to work really hard on my attire. I was just a bit intimidated about how you'd show up. So I was like, Ria, do I have to...
Forgive me for wearing jeans.
And the leather jacket.
Yeah. A lot of people wear leather jackets. I will say, again, my work, my first journalism job in the city really shaped, I think, what became of my career, which is that I grew up in an Indian American family in the United States with a narrative. We all have these family narratives that we tell, right? And sometimes they're rooted in reality, but they can grow quite estranged from reality also, right? They're narratives. They're not facts in themselves. And there's different Indian American communities in the US. Like in New York City, where I live, most Indian Americans are actually poor. But in the rest of America, outside of a couple of cities, Indian Americans are disproportionately fortunate and successful, highest earning group, et cetera. So if you're out, I was in the suburbs of Cleveland, Ohio, where that kind of New York City Indian underclass does not exist, and there's basically an affluent professional, like a lot of IIT people, a lot of IIM people, that kind of thing. And the family narrative that grew, the kind of Indian American family, and is both Indian and American, was a story of leaving a place, taking this huge risk, and then all by yourself, conjuring for yourself success in America. And this, in my family, we called it the $7 story because of the currency controls in the 70s. They came to America with $7, and now look, they had a nice house and a nice life, and isn't it amazing? And there's a lot of narratives. There's a lot of truth in that story. They took risks I will never have to take in my life. Like a lot of the choices they made seem insane, but you couldn't call your parent. You could call your parents twice a year.
Right.
In those days, there's no WhatsApp, right? They were really going out. It was a different thing to be an immigrant in that time. And the nature of the story being, we did this thing alone, was a very limited narrative. In part because of it erased a lot of privilege they had in this country before they left. They had a much better launch pad out of this country than a lot of people in this country would have had. They arrived in America with much better educations than most American people have. They spoke English from birth, which is not something most people in this country do. So a lot of that stuff of the systemic and structural benefits, which I think all of our societies have gotten better at talking about, was a little bit erased from the family narrative. It was a kind of a very American narrative of individuals striving and uplift. And when I came here and became a reporter here, raised with these kind of American, not just my parents' story, but just this American story that we all grow up with in the United States of people can rise through trying. And when you come to this country, I think, dramatizes what is true actually everywhere in the world, which is that most people do not make their own destiny.
Correct.
Most people are where they are because of things no person is powerful enough to counteract on their own. And it really shattered just being a reporter here. This is the first place I was a reporter, actually, even though I'd grown up somewhere else. It just shattered a lot of those stories. Those stories just didn't hold up, you know? And I think it was a very radicalizing experience for me. And then when I went back to the United States in 2009, you know, a year after the big financial crisis, I saw that what I had covered and written about here was true of the United States in a way that feels also not acknowledged a lot of the time. That the United States is a caste society also. And that's not a controversial thing to say in 2022. There's a book called Caste that came out last year by Isabel Wilkerson, a brilliant book, and she compares Nazi Germany, India, and the United States on race. And, you know, it's an incredibly powerful comparison. All three of these societies learn from each other in different ways how to stratify people. And so I think the formative experience of being a reporter here gave me a lens for looking at how much do people really shape their own destiny or not? What are the things that allow people to shape their own destiny or not? And what are the stories societies tell to justify distributions of power, of money, of whatever, that are insane? That if you actually looked at them on a piece of paper, you would say, this is insane. And what are the stories that are developed in India? What are the stories that are developed in America? What are the stories that are developed in France, elsewhere, that allow us to think that the insane is normal, to think that the insane is in fact the only way things could be? So I've gone on to write about many, many things, but I think that profoundly shaped what I felt my project was.
Got it. Okay, let's talk about the Persuaders, right? Much acclaim, fantastic press all over the globe. I'm just really curious. I mean, obviously the FT article piqued my interest, like it did for a lot of other people. It wasn't just about the fact that you and I are united in our love or hatred towards QR code menus, right? And your choice of alcohol. I do take my carbs, and I know you ignored them completely in that meal. I love reading Lunch with FT because I love seeing what people ate for lunch. But anyway, it was interesting. And whenever I'm in New York, I do plan to go visit the restaurant. So that's one thing. But tell us a little bit about how you morphed from this individual that was, not my words, yelling at people or telling people what to do. She describes this, this episode with Glenn Hubbard and how you lambasted him and also the audience. And you completely morphed into this individual who now says, it's not about telling people what to do. It's about asking them. It's about taking them along in the journey. It's about meeting them where they are. It's about showing them a vision for the future. Now that's quite a change in tack.
So this is what this Lunch with the FT article, this is what you just said is certainly how the article was framed.
Right.
That I have gone on some huge journey. I used to yell at people.
Yes. And
now I'm very gentle. Now, I never yelled at people as much as she said, and I'm not as gentle now as she said. But I understand the need for a narrative as a storyteller. Let me tell you my experience of it. The Persuaders is to be very transparent, The Persuaders is a book about the United States. My first book was about India, and it was only about India.
Right.
I didn't try to squeeze Japan into there, I write about a place at a time, and I write usually about places where I'm living. So I hope that there are things in these books that are true for other people in other places, and I suspect that there are, but I don't try to project those things, right? I let you find those things. The Persuaders is not a book arguing that in this moment of polarization that you have very much here, that is motivating me in the United States, that we need to all just be kind and gentle and, hold hands. If you've met me, that's never my posture. The Persuaders is motivated by a concern that in a time of polarization, of division, a time in which in many of our democracies, democracy itself feels wobbly, questionable. Significant number of people don't even necessarily want to renew democracy. in those kinds of times, I became concerned that the people who actually want less democracy, less human rights, a smaller we, less inclusion, more hate, that those people still believe in persuasion.
Right.
They still believe in changing minds. They still believe that you can make a different argument to different people in a different way. They still build TV networks to try to whip up consciousness. And on the other hand, and my sympathies are very clear in this fight, the people who want more democracy, my team, people want more democracy, more inclusion, who want our gay brothers and sisters to feel like free and full people, who want women to play the full range of roles that women can and want to play, who want trans people, who just see trans people as people, who, think that the more of us who are included, the better we all are, who want our children to have, water they can drink and air they can breathe 50 years from now. Somehow that kind of pro-democracy, pro-freedom movement has kind of, in many places, turned its back on persuasion, on the idea that people are redeemable, on the idea that you can make arguments to people and win them over, and the idea that people can grow, can change, can come around. And that duality to me, the people who want more inclusion and want more democracy, but refuse to take a chance on actually making a case to people because they're just so exhausted of it. They're so exhausted of their own intolerant uncles and their, I get it. I understand completely where this is coming from. I have been guilty of this, what I call in the book, the write-off myself. But if we end up in a situation where the most intolerant forces in our society believe in wooing people politically, and the more progressive, tolerant, pro-democratic forces believe that, those white people are always going to be, those men are always going to do, those Hindus are always going to, right?
Correct.
That kind of pose that those anti-vaccine people, whatever the fill in the blank, we've all heard that kind of write-off. We're going to lose our societies. We're going to lose our democracies. We're going to lose what made this country and the United States good and great. And so this book is an intervention. It is not a like stop yelling book. It is a book saying we who want more democracy, more inclusion, and more justice need to buck up and believe that we have something to say to people that is more thrilling, that is more exciting, that is not just warning that the other side is dangerous, but that is offering a positive, thrilling, charismatic, galvanizing vision. And I think whether you are in the United States looking at, Joe Biden, who, by the way, I think drastically overperformed my expectations for Joe Biden and a lot of people's. I think he's been a very, very good president compared to any kind of expectation I would have had. But when you say Joe Biden, just you listen to him speak, you look at, say, this is what is standing between the United States and the end of democracy. These speeches, this guy, it's a gamble, right? And I think in this country, I hear so much grumbling about Rahul Gandhi, and we can't afford to not be perfect right now in defense of democracy. Like, there's no space for slack. There's no space for mediocre speeches and mediocre candidates and mediocre messages. Like, everything is in the balance. If people who don't want more freedom, more democracy, more inclusion, a society that works for everyone, don't get their act together. And so this book is a passionate plea for those pro-democracy, pro-inclusion forces to reclaim persuasion, to get as interested and as talented at winning over people as the other side certainly is.
I think it's a great opportunity to, perhaps for you to narrate a real story for us, make this come alive for us. Your book is an amalgamation of many interviews that you've had with some activists, politicians, scientists, the people that you call real persuaders, that have had real conversations to propel real change. maybe tell us one of your favorite stories, make it come alive for us.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I've been to a few other countries on book tour since it came out, and I think in a context like India, some of the specifics of the people I write about. I mean, I'm giving you the kind of argumentative version of it, but that's not what the book is. The book is, as you say, stories of people grappling with this stuff. Real people in movement spaces, in activist spaces, in political spaces, in education, all kinds of areas where there's a question of how do you change things in a society by changing other people's minds.
I mean,
right?
I love the story of Linda.
Yep.
That's my story, but
Yep.
I mean, I'm sure you have a favorite too.
Yeah. But like each person I've chosen, even if you're not in the American context, I don't care about the American context. I chose a bunch of people, individuals, who work as part of larger groups, who have found kind of leverage points to change very big systems by changing how they show up in the conversation, right? And so I think that, I hope, is very universal. So I write about Linda Sarsour, who was one of the leading co-organizers of the Women's March against Donald Trump and events around the world that day and that have continued, right? Arab American, Palestinian activist who didn't even want to go to the Women's March when she first heard about it because she felt it was a kind of white woman's feminism that typically left out women like her, and went from not wanting to go to like becoming the co-chair, changing the whole thing, and organizing the largest single-day protest maybe in history. To Alicia Garza, another person I write about in the book, co-founded Black Lives Matter, right? How do you, as one person on social media, change the global conversation? I mean, I've been amazed watching Dalit activists in this country talk about their refraction of Black Lives Matter in this completely different but also similar context of this country. How does Alicia Garza, one person sitting in a bar tweeting on her phone, achieve that kind of leverage and change? I write about Loretta Ross, an older veteran activist in her mid-70s, who looks back on her career as an activist, reproductive justice advocate, looks back and says, that she worries that her activist community is too squeamish, is too worried about do you know all the right terms and language, and are you completely good at saying things properly, instead of worrying about are we pulling in 5% more members every week than we had the week before.
Right.
And so everyone I'm writing about in the book, in a way, they are dissidents within their movements and spaces and political worlds. About a third of the book is about AOC, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I spent a lot of time with her for the book. She is someone who is perceived and portrayed as strident, doctrinaire, kind of extremist. A lot of this is a very manufactured portrait of her. Some of it is based on reality, who she is. If you meet her in person, she'd probably strike you as the least doctrinaire person in this room. She's one of the shyest people I've ever met. I mean, she has that side to her for sure, but she is profoundly in her mind an organizer who is looking at a room like this thinking, I can make this case to this person based on this issue. I can make this case to this person. And she's brilliant at that. And so we have a whole conversation that becomes a big part of the book about what it's like to conceive of yourself as a persuader, as someone who's really making those nuanced calculations about how to bring people in, showing respect for their moral frames and their ways of looking at something, but then kind of have the lightning strike you as a famous star overnight for being doctrinaire. Correct. And morally certain. And her struggle with that, I think, is very illuminating. I'll tell you one story that I think, in terms of like an actual, it's one of the hardest stories in the book, but I think it's so extreme that it illustrates something that I learned from all of these people in the book. Loretta Ross, this reproductive justice advocate, she's now probably 75, and she's someone a lot of, particularly women of color activists in the US would consider like a godmother of various movements they're part of, from feminist movements to racial justice movements, pro-democracy movements in general. When Loretta was a young woman, she was the executive director of a of a fabulous organization called the DC Rape Crisis Center in Washington, D.C. And it's an interesting organization in Washington because it deals with the issue of rape on two levels. It provides just basic services to women, like just what you need in the moment, and it works on a policy level, right? So it's also lobbying and doing, I think, like theater to move public opinion. It's trying to work at all levels to rid the world of this scourge. And so when she's running this, she's a militant activist who kind of goes into running this nonprofit. And she gets a letter from Lorton. Lorton is this big prison in Virginia, a little bit south of Washington, D.C. And it's from a guy named William Fuller. And this guy writes to the DC Rape Crisis Center saying, I am in prison serving a long sentence for rape. On the outside, I raped women. On the inside, prison, I now rape men. It's not about the gender for me, it's about power. I want to stop raping, but I don't know how to do it. Can you help me? Imagine getting this letter. And so Loretta's first reaction was like, fuck you. Like,
Of course.
I'm running a center to help women. I have not enough money. I can probably help 1% of the people I would like to be helping.
Correct.
I can pass 1% of the laws that I would like to be passing. And you're not even you're still doing it. You want me to help you? And then she took, but something in her, it just stuck, the letter stuck with her, right? And she took it to her board, and her board was also like, no. Of all the things we could do with our life and time and money and resources, we're gonna help this guy? It's not our purpose. It's not. But it didn't leave their minds, right? Something in his request stuck with them. And they had more discussions and more discussions. And she came back around, and the question that flipped it for her was, we're a rape crisis center. If we don't have a project or a plan to stop men raping, what are we doing here? Are we just in the business of like bandaging women and just bandaging more and more women, and like, or are we here to stop this thing? And what happens when a man, admittedly flawed man, is saying, I want you to help me stop this phenomenon in me that you're trying to stop in the world? And so they had this reframe, and they created, to make the long story short, they created something that became a very celebrated and successful organization across prisons in the United States called Prisoners Against Rape. And this woman, Loretta Ross, goes into Lorton. She brings in feminist literature. It's the only thing she brings in. She tells them, I'm not bringing you snacks. I'm not bringing you cigarettes. You're getting like bell hooks and books. And they started these feminist reading group discussions with these men in prisons. And then it grew so successful that this started happening in prisons across the country. A lot of these men were really changed. She ran into William Fuller on the street years later, and he was like completely changed man. Anyway, the reason that story is in the book, along with so many others, is it takes to a completely extreme level a question I think a lot of us are actually grappling with in various forms, politically, family-wise, et cetera, which is, what is the place for, to put it mildly, imperfect allies in the kind of future we want, right? The example I just gave you is like the most dialed up possible. This woman existed to eliminate rape in the world, and a rapist reached out to her and said, can you help me? Can I be part of this? And she said no, and then she said yes, and it changed a lot of people's lives.
Wow.
So what does that mean when we have those religious bigot uncles? And what does it mean when we have people who think this whole pronouns thing is just too complicated, and this is where they get off the bus? And where do we stand when, women have to are forced at work to constantly justify their own presence and existence? And where do we find those moments of patience? And where do we say I refuse to do this kind of engagement because it belittles me? I think that story with Loretta, out of 100 little anecdotes in the book and a handful of much bigger, so it really stands out to me because it deals with the core question of this age, which is if we want to have progress win, whether it's Loretta's goal of eliminating rape from the world in that moment or building a more future of progress in other ways, how do we stand for something, not compromise our values, but pull people in, including people who are very, very difficult cases?
It's a fantastic and a very fascinating example, and I'm sure we all agree. I guess my question is, this act of building bridges, right? Pulling people in, taking them along, especially in the light of the example you just gave me, it seemed like a very daunting and rather impossible task. As you said, I think somewhere trying to reach the unreachable, right? How do you persuade the persuaders that it's really worth their time and their energy? Because this needs it needs tons of resources, time, patience, and all of those things.
Yeah.
Right?
So let's make this more practical, right? I think I've tried to make the case to you, first of all, that it's worth the effort that it often doesn't feel like it's worth right now to try with people, to try to sell the future you want to people who are still skeptical of it, right? And I think there is as someone who spent years writing about this country and now writes about the United States, I think there's such profound differences, and obviously the issues are very specific to each country, but I actually think there is something very common to what is happening in India at a very high level and what is happening in the United States, which is we are very bad at mass identity transitions, right? The United States is essentially a country in which all wealth, power, and influence was concentrated among white men until very, very recently. And in the period, kind of your and my lifetimes, we decided to just stop doing that and progressively share wealth and power and influence with everyone. We're not all the way there, but that has kind of been the defining drama. That's what we've been doing in my lifetime in the United States, right? There's individual pieces of legislation, there's presidents here and there, but actually that basic thing of the last 40, 50 years has been pretty constant. It continued under Trump, it continued, it's just what we're doing. And it's really, really hard for people. Doesn't mean it's the wrong thing to do.
Right.
And I think in this country, there's a lot of difficulty that's been there from the beginning about, are we a cosmopolitan society for all? Or are we a primarily Hindu nation with, some wonderful other people that we will smilingly tolerate? And that has been an argument forever in this country. And who wins that argument, or who is winning that argument in a given moment, changes. I think one of the core pieces of kind of practical advice I wanted to provide in the Persuaders through a chapter I have on political messaging is that in that argument, I think those of us who want the bigger we are kind of really falling short at explaining it and articulating it and making it feel more exciting than what the people who want a smaller we are selling, because this is not a fair fight. It is really easy to sell a smaller we. It may sound counterintuitive. In a democracy, the more people but it's really easy to stoke grievance of groups, particularly when you have these kind of changes, right?
Fair.
Whether it's in India or the United States, there is an upheaval in gender relations
Right.
that is essentially unprecedented. What has happened in the last 50 years is more than what happened in the last 5,000 years. in some of these things, right? It's so fast. Like, we sometimes feel change isn't fast enough, but it's actually insanely fast in a different way. It may not be fast enough for us, right? But think about, if you're a woman in this room, think about what you do in your life, and then think about, maybe your mother did some of that. For some of you, your mother will have had roughly as much freedom as you. For others of you, you are the kind of first to have that, right? But by the time we're getting to anybody's grandmother in this room, I'm guessing it's a pretty steep drop-off. Most of the things you value that you're able to do in your life as a woman, I would bet almost no one in this room's grandmother. And then you just keep going from there, right? Like choosing whether you have children or not, or just basic elemental, choosing what you eat or not, right? And so we have actually done a lot. And so it is really easy as an entrepreneurial politician to go in and say, I don't know, you can't get a job, look at all these Mexicans coming in. Or you work so hard and women don't come in and put a meal in front of you. It's really easy to take these social changes and stir up hatred around them. To make the case for a bigger we requires effort. You really have to explain to men whose father got that hot meal every day, and whose grandfather's got that hot meal, and whose great-grandfather's got. I think it's a better. I mean, if I want a hot meal in my house, I have to heat it. My wife may have written The Art of Gathering, but she doesn't focus on the food part. I'm the cook in the family, and
that makes
I'm
sense.
very happy with the world I live in.
Yeah,
but I don't think we've sold it to these men. I think the people who want to go backwards have gotten into those men's heads, they've gotten into those men's hearts, they've explained their pain to them, they've narrated their stress to them, they've blamed culprits. And those of us who actually think it is better for everyone to live in a society in which women can be all the things women can be, I think we have failed to convince a lot of people that this is actually a better world, that's a more fun world, that an empowered woman is a lot more fun to spend 50 years with in a marriage, that a woman whose thoughts are constantly being put in a bottle, it's actually not fun for anyone, starting with her. But I don't think, or to go to the United States and race, I think it's very easy to say they're waging a war on white people, and it's very easy, and people have won elections on it. It's harder to make a case for this is a country that was founded with some beautiful words on paper, beautiful ideals that inspired countries around the world, and we have consistently, persistently failed to live up to them, but we're getting better. We have gotten better. We're getting better now. We're including people in the United States that have never been included in most societies throughout history. We're doing it, and it's more fun on the other side. The food's getting better. The browner the United States gets, the food just gets better and better and better. The dance parties are getting better. The office meetings are getting smarter. The ideas are getting better. Silicon Valley would not exist without immigrants. But it's not self-evident. And so a lot of what the book is about is we have to make this case. If you want a plural India, you don't have to, this is not the people who the case has to be made to, right? Very middle of the road, middle class, lower middle class, poor Indians need to feel more excited by that picture of an India for everyone than feel excited by a picture of an India for some. And I think we sometimes rest on the laurels of righteousness, and that's really a huge mistake. It is not enough to stand there and say, we represent inclusion, therefore we're better, and the other side is fascist, they suck, whatever. It doesn't work. Your side has to be more thrilling, more fun. I read a great tweet a long time ago. I wish I'd found the person. It just went into my memory and disappeared from Twitter. The tweet said that the secret to winning in politics is to have your side not be totally fucking exhausting. And it resonated with me so deeply because, we get into these, what is this advertising strategy and this and that? But like, is your side more fun? Seriously, I don't mean to trivialize the very complicated matter of politics, which I spend my life writing about. But I think a lot of our movements for a better world are actually kind of tedious and boring and jargony and lackluster, or put really uncharismatic candidates in the front, just hoping that the self-evident righteousness of plural values wins the day. And we have to stop this thing, and we have to believe that persuasion is possible, that it's worth it, and we have to kind of start stretching and building our muscles of saying it's going to take a tremendous amount of work in India, in the United States, in a lot of Europe, in Brazil, to actually persuade people that a future for everyone is more fun, is more prosperous, has more opportunity for them and their kids, is more practical. It's just better.
Fantastic. You and I have a couple of other things in common, and heating dinner or making dinner, not that I make it, my spouse does, so I think that bit as well.
So he and I have that in common.
Yeah, exactly. And so that vision for the future, I think, resonates really well. So when Ria asked me to moderate this event, I have to be really candid. I was like, I am really not the right candidate, because you should just get a journalist. I'm this mixture of an academic, a coach. I run a consulting firm that focuses on organization design solutions. Are you sure you really want me? And perhaps it was for the lack of getting anybody else, but I did, sort of as I dug deeper into your book, you very kindly sent me the PDF. And I realized that my own the way I talk about my own learnings in life and the book that I've written on coaching and leadership. To me, I talk about every individual, regardless of the size of their teams. Every leader is a coach, whichever genre you're in, whether you run your own venture capital, whether you're a corporate leader, which is how Penguin wanted me to write the book, for an aspiring leader. It's not about the size of your teams. It could be an individual performer, but the way to progress, and you have to move away from a culture of instruction to motivation. It's about moving away from telling people what to do to asking them what to do, right? That was the basis. That was the whole sort of premise of the book I wrote. And it got a lot of press because suddenly people thought it was a revolutionary idea. I wasn't saying anything new, to be honest. It was really about every individual being a coach, about leading with impact and influence, ensuring that you build those reservoirs of trust, you're empathetic towards the individual. And more than ever, COVID has shown us that we need leaders that are empathetic, that take others along in the journey, that embody a growth mindset, right? A lot of what Carol Dweck said. To me, a lot of those tenets came alive when I was reading your book. You said it differently. But to me, the Persuaders in so many ways embodied that. And what I really want to leave this audience with today is, as you said, some really practical learnings about how do we here in this group today, and how can we become better persuaders? How can we take people along in the journey? How can we show them the vision for the future? I'm going to open this up for questions later, but I really want you to talk to us about.
Yeah, I love that, and thank you for conquering that initial skepticism or
politics in the corporate world. I thought the twain wouldn't meet, but clearly there's so much
here at the Quorum. Anything's possible. You can use that as a quote. I know they will, too. It's such a good question. Look, something about the methodology of my books really will help explain that, which is I take a very general theme, including when I wrote my first book about India, and then I just find people I want to follow who are like vaguely involved with that theme. But I don't know where it's going to go. I don't have some argument. Like, I'm just following them. They don't know what's going to happen, and I don't know what's going to happen. And all I know is, like, I was interested in, like, social change in India, and I was interested in how that refracts through love. So I followed a couple of people dealing with trying to find love, and I how that relates to ambition. And I found someone who was trying to rise out of a very small town in central Maharashtra, so on and so forth. This book, same thing. This broad theme of, are we writing people off, or are we believing and attempting to pull people in? And I followed a bunch of people. But I just follow the individuals. And at the end, I'm always curious, is there something common across these different stories, right? Because these are all different people. And I always ascribe great value to whatever ends up being really in common across the stories, because the stories have nothing in common. They're different stories with their own logics. And so if there's a few things that actually do end up in common, I take those very seriously, because I think they represent a kind of deeper emergent wisdom. So let me tell you what some of those things are. Whether it's a Black Lives Matter activist in the book, or AOC, or Loretta Ross, or a teacher on race education, or other people I write about, messaging consultant, others. I think the fundamental mental model of every persuader I wrote about in the book is different from most of our mental models about people on the other side of us on issues, right? I think the general mental model many of us have, we get this guy some water, maybe a pat on the back. The general mental model many of us have with people who disagree with us, people on the other side of issues, is that they're monoliths, right? That conviction that separates them from us, it goes all the way down in them. They're white supremacists, they're Hindu nationalists, they're anti-vaxxers to the core. Pick your disagreement. And the people I'm writing about in the Persuaders, they all view people on the far shore from them politically as being complicated, confused, torn. They don't minimize the stance that person is taking or the view that they have. It's not about that. They just actually afford the people far away from them the kind of dignity that we all give ourselves to know that we are complicated.
Right.
I know I'm complicated. I feel all kinds of ways about things, and I'm 60-40 about a lot of them. What I may tell you is the 60% that prevailed over the 40. It's like a tournament, right? And so what you're hearing is the opinion that prevailed through the quarterfinals and the semifinals and the finals of my heart, and I'm just telling you the tournament winner idea. But there's another part of me that feels the opposite about that. We all have that, right? And the persuaders I write about in this book, they all are fundamentally looking at other people who say, this is not a country for that religion, or trans people have no business, whatever. And they wonder, they look at those people and they think, I wonder what else is going on in that person. I wonder what the seeds of contradiction are in that person. Not, how do I implant tolerance in that person? Right. They view those people as having an unresolved civil war in themselves about all kinds of stuff, because they know themselves to have that. So then, and this, one of the places this really was most effective in the US was on gay rights, right? Which I think in all of our lifetimes is probably the issue where there's been the most unexpected, kind of now relatively consensus progress. That was just a totally brutal war of persuasion that won, that prevailed. And a lot of the best work that I read about in the book grew out of that movement. They started by saying, okay, so you are saying you hate gay people. You are saying you don't think they should get married. You're saying you don't hate them, but you think they shouldn't have special rights. Whatever your argument is. Okay. What other resources do we have going on in the heads of people saying that? Maybe you have an identity, in addition to hating gay people, where you think of yourself as a champion of the underdog. And you're going to laugh at this example, but it's actually a true thing. A lot of people identify with sports teams that always lose. You may know people like this in your life, right? And actually, for like the Mets in New York, where I live, right? The Mets are never going to win. And particularly for working class New York, the Mets, people will always support the Mets. And if you just think about sports in a normal thing of like winning and losing, it makes no sense that there would ever be a Mets fan. But particularly I think for a certain kind of blue collar New York who are accustomed to life being hard and not always winning in their own lives, maybe, I'm kind of imagining it here, like the Mets is an identity. They could switch to the Yankees, a team with a lot of money and a lot of, more chance of winning pennants, but they're Mets fans. Their identity is the team that loses, the underdogs that give it a valiant try. Now, the activists I'm writing about in the book, they're sitting there thinking, maybe you hate gay people, but maybe you think you're an amazing champion of underdogs. And maybe, if I can talk to you about this a little bit, if I can try to elicit why you're such a champion of underdogs, why you always feel like you pull for the people who have less power in an equation, if I can elicit that from you, maybe at some point I can ask you how that sits with the fact that you are punching down at a group of people whose only demand is to be able to love whoever they want to love. And in a significant number of cases, I read about this experiment called deep canvassing in the book, where people go spend half an hour at the door, knocking on doors, talking to people for half an hour on gay rights, on trans rights, on immigration, different issues. And these kinds of conversations change minds in half an hour. They found, scientists who studied this found that they were able to change people's minds on the door in half an hour, as much as years of diffuse social change, watching television, reading tweets, as much as that stuff changes minds. And it wasn't because some microchip of a foreign opinion was planted in that person on the door. It was because that person had other stories in them too. And the persuaders on the door, unlike most of us, unlike me, I would say, had the instinct to put aside, okay, fine, you hate them, you think they're terrible, you think they're a danger to kids, great, just get it out. And then, but what else do you think? Do you think you're a good person? Interesting. Do you think you're someone who, by the way, one of the things that's most effective on the door, have you ever been treated badly because of factors beyond your control? Oh my gosh, yes, when I moved here from California, my gosh, they were so terrible to me at my workplace. Interesting. How does that, this is a real example, how does that square the way you felt at the beauty salon when your colleagues are being so mean to you because you came from somewhere else? How does that square with what you were just saying about how awful it is that your nephew is transitioning? Oh, I guess I'm doing the same thing, right? I'm not unrealistic. This does not happen all the time. There's some people who are like, no, my nephew is an abomination. Like that happens. But in more cases than we would realize, people have, you probably know this phrase, it's a corporate world phrase, I think, strong opinions lightly held. We tend to overestimate how many people's strong opinions are strongly held. A lot of people hold strong opinions lightly, which is to say they hold the opinions, but they don't know a lot about them. Right. There's not deep roots under the tree. Sure. And someone coming into their lives, whether in a family context, a political context, a candidate who actually has the charismatic and explanatory skills to justify the kind of vision of the country that candidate seeks, can actually move people. It happens all the time. It has happened in our lifetimes on a whole bunch of issues. And I really believe that I wanted to equip people with the skills to do that, whether in your life, but it starts, tip number one, and the foundational tip, is recognize the complexity of people on the far side from you.
Fantastic. I mean, you have 6 of these tips. We don't have the time to go into all 6 of them, but I strongly urge you to download that guide, if not the entire. It's on
the website.
Yeah, you should do that.
thepersuadersbook.com. It's a free PDF.
Yeah.
Of 6 practical tips.
Thank you. That was awesome. But I would absolutely love to open this up to all these wonderful folk who I can't really see in the dark. But if they have questions,
I'm sure they exist.
I'm sure they exist.
Are there any questions? I'd love to bring a mic to you.
I don't need the mic. It's okay. You were concerned about the recording. Yeah, the recording. It's okay. You mentioned that in recent times it's always been, whether it's a Trump or we won't take names. But if you go back in history, I think it's probably a function of the times which create the person. I mean, there was a Gandhi, there was a Martin Luther King, okay, and there was Obama before Trump. Isn't it possible that the person is thrown up with the extremity of time, and that inflection point is reached by a number of forces? And I think it'll happen as we go along. I think that extremity has not been reached to throw up a Martin Luther King or a Gandhi. Is that possible?
I mean, I think certainly the complexity and the extremity of times do influence which leaders we get, but I don't think it influences them in a straightforward or predictable way. I think, for example, I think it matters a lot who the leaders on offer are and what the arguments are. I don't think there's anything. I mean, so let me say this in the American case, and I think it's relatively applicable here. I think there's one way of telling the story about America right now where you'd say, of course, a country in those conditions would be voting for a far-right nationalist demagogue, right? And you could say it's a time of demographic change. The country's becoming a majority-minority country within our lifetimes. The unearned privileges of white people and men have been questioned in the last 20 years as never before in the previous 200 years. You could take those conditions and say, yeah, absolutely, Trump would be the obvious thing happening. But you could tell a totally different story, which is, this is a moment in which the United States is experiencing the bounties of actually bringing more people into the conversation. And why wouldn't that be a moment when the opposite kind of forces would, I think it depends. If there are people who ran on Trump-like things before Trump, and it never caught. He was a singular, somehow, and it's sort of incomprehensible, but also comprehensible. Somehow, he was able to incarnate for people this resentment. I think partly because of his IQ, and I mean that very seriously, that he was able to simplify a grievance to a level where it was just raw resentment and grievance, and there was no dressing it up as economic issues. It was just I don't like sharing my country with these people, and I don't feel like I have to anymore, right? And he just made that super explicit. And I think in the time period since he's come up, including that election and beyond, I think we've run really lousy, good people in their hearts, but I don't feel like we're bringing the Sachin Tendulkars of politics up against the movement that he represents. I think we're bringing well-meaning and quite boring people who do not have real mass movements, who do not make anybody's heart stir, right? I mean, I have so many friends who work for Joe Biden, work for Hillary. They come over for dinner, they'll tell you they're not particularly inspired by them. It doesn't mean they're not good people, right? But the people who've worked for them their whole life will tell you that, yeah, they're trying to do the right thing, it's, right? Whereas the people working for the crazy people are passionate. And they believe, and they got their calisthenics and everything. So I think we can't be lazy in intense times and just tell ourselves that the right thing will be thrown up by the intensity of the moment. I think this is a massive organizing challenge, and we need those movements for progress to be telling a better story, and to be not just telling a better story up here, but when you walk through Dada or any other neighborhood in this city, Like, people should feel more excited by the picture of progress. And I think when you set that as the standard, it becomes very clear that we're almost not even attempting to do that, let alone failing at the attempt.
Are there any other? Oh, right here.
Hi, Anand. My name is Purva. That was a lovely talk. Very nice stories, very powerful stories. And I love the playbook, the last question that you asked about what can we do at an individual level. I love the playbook that you shared. I work at Google, and I'm wondering what can corporates do when it comes to, let's say, driving or persuading mass opinion by themselves, by themselves, and the second part of the question is also by allowing what is shared on platforms, because in this global youth kind of era, not everybody will have the attention span to be persuaded. Thanks.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I mean, I think if you work in tech, you have an extraordinary role to play in these things. You know, as you know, I mean, from Google, and I don't know what area you work in, but one of the fascinating things about Google is Google's been able to conquer all these different areas, right? The one thing Google's never been able to do with all the money in the world is social networks, social media. Why is that? Because it's the only thing that is about people. Like, people are the hardest problem, right? Google, with all the money on earth, cannot build a social network that works, right? And by the way, all the people who do have one and are making money on it cannot run them well. They're all making us worse and like dumber and meaner and crueler, and right? Like, people are still people. And I think this question of, is it even possible for these tech companies to build platforms that actually make us better than we are rather than worse than we are every time we log on? It's just like a very existentially important question, and I think no one has solved it. And like, some people don't want to solve it. Like, you know, I think I don't think Elon Musk is attempting to make people kinder and nicer to each other online and falling short of his goal. Like, I think he's a very small, limited boy who does not want the kind of conversation, is not capable of having, first of all, the kind of conversation that advances or progresses or grows anything, and doesn't want other people to have it either. You know, so I think there's just a huge role for tech to play in figuring out content moderation and how you actually invite people into conversations and make them better, not worse, incentivize good behavior, not bad. And there's very smart people working on it, and like, no one has solved it. So that's one. And then the other thing is, you know, and I don't really know how that works here as much, because here, I mean, clearly newspapers, I think, are a thriving business here still, you know, maybe not the rest of the world. But in the United States, the online advertising duopoly of Google and Facebook has really eliminated local media, and it's really different. I mean, you just do not have the kind of thriving newspaper scene that you have in this country, in the US. Like, very large parts of the US are basically not covered by local media anymore. In other words, like, there's entire states in the US that do not have a publication that has a full-time correspondent covering the state legislature. And the United States, like India, states have a lot of power by themselves, right? So states set education policy, they set abortion policy, all kinds of things. There are states where there's literally not one full-time journalist covering the deliberations of the state. Like, it's only written about if there's some big national story that reaches the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. And a lot of that is driven by online ads, the shift to online ads. And so, you know, Google has tried in the US, you know, in small ways, to say, okay, what does the future of local news look like? How can we be part of rebuilding it? But I think for tech companies to figure out how to support and revive, not local opinion, but like local reporting, like what is happening in these rooms? Who is giving the money? Who is taking the money? What is the money for? That kind of reporting, which is what I grew up learning and revering, and the reason I wanted to be a reporter, is vanishing, you know? And I do think tech companies in a way have a responsibility to say, are there ways we can support that, or to get that back, figure out what the 21st century version of that is? Because it's going to be very hard to live in democracies where, you know, we think democracy is just voting, but where we don't have good information, where people don't have good information. People don't know. People literally do not know how their member of their state legislator who represents them is voting, because there's no publication telling them that.
Does that answer your question? Thank you.
I have a question.
Sure.
That's why I spoke aloud, because we're in the dark recesses right here.
I love it.
I am absolutely convinced and like working towards, or actually equally frustrated with the righteous smugness and the cynicism that happens in leftist communities about not engaging the other, right? Or not engaging with folks. And excited about trying out, you know, like one of my key ideas is let's have a cadre of comics or a cadre of stand-up comics come and talk about these things rather than the way we do. But given the last question, right, around what's happening in India, like, you know, you see Prannoy Roy handing over NDTV, and you see what's happening with Twitter. Given that kind of like material reality, what is your like understanding of how can we, given that that's the conjuncture we are in, we still have to work hard and we still have to figure something out. What is your suggestion in terms of how we can be clever with our narrative strategy and in a moment that we are perhaps even losing social media, right? Or maybe we never had it, but we had this illusion that we had it. And then the second question I have is about, I had an opportunity to talk to folks who did the defund the police narrative strategy. And that's not a strategy that's drawing people into a vision, or it was purposefully chosen as a controversial narrative. Folks, when they were choosing that narrative, knew that when we say defund the police, there's going to be a big hoo-ha and challenge and polarization, but they chose it, and some would argue that it actually helped. Like, sometimes you do need to hold the extreme position to start the conversation. So I'm really curious how you make sense of both the material reality we're in, as well as like narrative strategies that may not be inclusive in the ways that they are framed in the beginning.
I love that. Both of those are such good questions. And let's do it in backwards order. You are absolutely right. And one of the things, and I don't want the book to be misunderstood, I'm giving you a very high-level version, but this book in many ways is a repudiation of a kind of view of persuasion that is all about diluting things and watering things down and compromising what you stand for just to make people comfortable. Right? A big part, AOC is the centerpiece of the book, because I actually think the persuasion that works in the 21st century is multimodal, it's hybrid, and it involves a mix of provocation, commanding attention, picking fights, and having enough empathy for people on the other side to write the right messages for them, to understand what their inner conflicts are enough to peel them away from their cousins and neighbors. None of this is like water things down to defund the, I'm with you on defund the police. I don't think the purpose of defund the police, which was this slogan that activists on the left in the US used after the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020, some made this claim of like defund the police, right? And the actual policy program, by the way, is to redirect. US police departments are just like hugely funded. In many towns, it'll be like 80% of the budget for like a small town would just go to police, right? There's no mental health resources, there's no drug rehab, anything, there's no beds for homeless people. So the policy that was being advocated was if you're in a town and you're spending 80% of your money on police, maybe cut like a third of that,
Right.
and maybe put some homelessness beds and some drug treatment. That's what the actual thing was, and the slogan was defund the police. And a lot of people said, well, that's a divisive slogan, and there was a whole dispute about that. I'm someone who thinks, I think with you, capturing the attention of an enormous country, India and the United States are both very large, loud, decentralized democracies where it's very hard to get everybody to talk about anything all at once. Defund the police got everybody talking about something. And I'm sort of the school as a storyteller that, like, if you can do that, that's an important thing. So they may have even lost some short-term elections because of that. They may have put some people in a position where they had to answer for the activists and, but that's not how I view politics. Like, to me, it was kind of the first time in my lifetime where in a mainstream way, we were debating whether more police is always better. Generally, there's a kind of thing that, like, if you have crime, just like throw some more police there. And they were saying, we'll get safer if we tie the police's hands behind their back. Now, you may agree or disagree with that, but to get a whole country talking about that is a very powerful achievement, right? So so in the book really makes a case for that kind of approach to persuasion where we're not all doing the same thing. Some people are saying defund the police. Some people are putting, soup or whatever it was on paintings to protest climate change. I don't think Al Gore needs to be doing that. But do I think there's a place for somebody? We all saw that image when they did that to those paintings, right? We all saw that. I think there's a real power to stopping the global conversation in its tracks, or stopping the national, provoking, getting attention. But I don't think that can be the only skill you have. You need someone else in the orchestra, someone else in the coalition, to also be able to eke out victories and be pragmatic, and So that's on that. And then on the material point, it's an important point. And I think in some ways it feels like a lot of intellectual spaces or institutional spaces are being lost. I mean, Twitter has been for my sins, a big part of my life since when I joined in 2009, right? It's a big part of my life. It's not just because I am like an addict, it's because if you are an independent journalist in 2022, that's literally how people find your work.
Right.
Right? Some of you here may know about my work because of that. Right? I once ran into a young man on the street in Brooklyn where I live, and he said, I just want to say I love your writing. And I was like, thank you so much. And he said, do you write anywhere other than Twitter? It's one of the saddest moments of my whole life. But so true, such an insightful question. So yeah, those spaces being conquered is scary, and TV channels, and we have our Fox Newses and various things in the U.S.
I was waiting for Fox News to come up.
But I also think those of us who want that more progressive future still hold a lot of institutional power in all kinds of places and are not using it properly, and are not, whether it's very moderate, sober, cautious newspapers that refuse to call threats to democracy, right? That's not a question of, in many cases, of the wrong owner. It's just like, it's a question of deep, abiding institutional cautiousness that has been overtaken by events, right? And I know my friends are the people who make these decisions in America. It's not rich owners who are stopping. It's like the deep culture of what they think journalism is. And it's outdated. And and in other cases, it is some owner, and that's a much harder case. But I think a lot of us have not stepped up to the moment that we're in, And as spaces like Twitter or spaces like NDTV or whatever fall or get captured, it's going to become all the more important for those spaces that are still in the hands of a kind of more open vision of the society to really redouble the efforts to pull people in and show people a vision of our societies that they see themselves in and that they see themselves drawn to, and explain what is happening to them in a way that is a more compelling explanation than what the other side is doing. The last thing I'll say on this is, I think one of the supreme skills of extremist movements around the world is in their explanatory power. It may be bullshit explanation, but at least they try to explain. They don't just say, yeah, it's tough out there in the economy right now. They say it's tough out there in the economy for you because China did this to you. Or because, bankers did this to you. That's the new Italian leader. That's what she's saying. She means Jews when she says bankers, but that's her way of couching this kind of Mussolini light stuff that she does, Or people will say Muslims are doing this to you, or black people, whatever. Everyone, there's a lot of variants of the same message. And we have to counter this very effectively to say, here's actually why this stuff is happening to you. There's an explanation, but there's a counter explanation. Here's why prices are actually high right now. Here's why it's hard to get a job. Here's why, you're feeling like your community is changing in a way that you can't quite keep a grip on. I think a lot of progressive forces have essentially conceded the work of explaining the world to the Elon Musks and the captured TV networks. And that is actually not the fault of Elon Musk or the captured TV networks. That is the fault of all the people who are not doing that explanatory work. And I think, as a journalist for a long time, I think my profession has failed to explain the world to people in ways that don't drive them into the arms of people offering a much simpler, clearer explanation. I still think there's a lot of territory we have and a lot of things we can do, those of us who want a bigger we and a more tolerant and just world.
It's 9:10, and I would urge you to have conversations with Anand on the side. I want to say thank you to him for a fantastic session, for sharing his learnings with us, but also for writing such a fabulous book, for showing us hope, for telling us there is a possibility that we can still fix a broken world. Thank you again. It was mind-blowing listening to you. And thank you for all the lessons in helping us become better persuaders.
Well, thank you, Ruchira, and thank you to all of you for coming tonight. Really special to have this conversation with you here. Thank you. And I'll be signing books and happy to say hi to you more personally there.